Welcome back to the channel, everyone. We're going to finally talk about another Nexus device. This is actually the last Nexus device that was ever made, or at least the Nexus phone for that matter, until the Pixel line came out, and rightfully so. I think Google and every other Google collaborator like HTC and all them really needed to go and switch away from the Nexus line, especially after the Nexus 6P. This phone was a phone that really never quite held down what it was supposed to do, and the impact that it kind of had on the Nexus line is very, very weird. And I kind of like the 6P. When this phone came out at that time, I was like, why else would anybody else need a phone other than this one? Like, this phone really had it all. There was really nothing that this phone couldn't do that, other phones couldn't do either, so this phone for sure was a very good phone at the time when it was released, but ever since then, its legacy has really, really gone down. And once I kind of explain it to you, it'll probably make sense. But this thing came out in 2015, and it'll actually be turning 5 years old. Right now it's about 4.5. Eventually, in September of this year, it'll turn 5 years, and it doesn't even feel like that. Like, this phone, it doesn't even look like a super ugly phone. I mean, it definitely has a lot of bezel on it. It definitely looks a little bit outdated, but it doesn't look ugly. It doesn't look like it's, a phone that nobody wants to use anymore. A lot of phones that you still might see people use are still kind of look like this. And when you look at other phones that were in the market in 2015, you have phones like the iPhone 6s Plus and, the iPhone, other phones as well. It's not just this one. But overall, this phone, definitely in terms of the way it looks and everything, it doesn't look too bad. So on the front of it, it has a 5.7-inch OLED display. And like I saw last year and like I see now, I mean, this panel is still extremely good. It's a very good looking panel. There's nothing on this phone that makes me think, it's super bad. It's 1440p and is 518 pixels per inch, and this panel for sure at the end of the day was one of the better looking panels on any phone at that time, and even now it still doesn't look super outdated. Yeah, there's some phones out there that look way better, and now you have, especially with the Galaxy S20, you have 120 Hz on those displays too, which are extremely good, and that's something that you can't get with a software update or anything like that. But in terms of the way this phone looks just in terms of the display, it definitely looks pretty good for the majority of people who are going to use it. But now if you're getting it 5 years later, you do have to kind of keep in mind that, there is going to be some burn-in on it. With the Nexus 6P, with a lot of them that I've been able to see, they have quite a bit of burn-in on them, which is not the best thing in the world. Since then, with the Android 10, especially with the new gesture-based design, we've now been able to see a lot of that burn-in go away because the nav bar buttons are away now. So one thing to kind of keep in mind, not the end of the world or anything, but that is one thing. The display, in my opinion, still looks pretty decent. You have front-facing speakers on this thing, which is really, really nice. You have USB Type-C on this phone, which was the first time we saw it on a Nexus device. That's actually a really, really cool thing. Even back in 2015, there were still a lot of phones that had the micro USB port. To give you an example, the Samsung Galaxy S8, that was the first Samsung phone to bring USB Type-C, came out in 2017, and this phone came out in 2015. So kind of a big thing right there. Not the end of the world, but that is one thing you kind of have to keep in mind. On the back, you can see we have a fingerprint sensor on this thing, which is really cool. This was the first time we saw a fingerprint sensor on a Nexus device. Same thing with the 5X, they were released at the same time. As well as that camera up top, and the camera was definitely an interesting thing. A lot of people didn't get it. I really didn't get it at the time, but it kind of looked good, and the way this phone overall felt and just looked like, it just looked like such an interesting phone. When you felt it in your hands and you held it, it really did feel like a pretty interesting device, and it still felt pretty premium for the most part. Like I said, it wasn't the most premium device in the world, it wasn't the best looking, but at that time, it was one of the better looking devices, and it felt very good. Not the best in the world, but like I said, it still felt very, very good. However, now that we're still talking about the body, this is one of the more important things about this phone. There were some issues where this phone was super easy to bend, and you kind of have to keep in mind this was the same type and same era as the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus, and those phones were really easy to bend too, but the Nexus 6P was very easy to bend as well. You can bend this thing very, very easily. What did not take that much effort at all. If you kept it in a case or whatever, I'm sure it was okay, but that is one thing you have to keep in mind. This phone was very easy to bend at the time, and even now, obviously nothing has changed in the body, so overall, it looked very good, it felt very good, but the ruggedness of it just really wasn't the best at the time. Now moving on to the software, this thing was released with Android Marshmallow. We are able to get Android 8.0 Oreo on it, and that's really all the versions of software that it got, which kind of was a long time, I mean, it lasted since 2015 up until Android Oreo, which I think was about 2018-ish or 2017, something like that. It got a couple versions of software, which is really nice. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that because of the software on this thing, the Nexus device was known for its software. This thing was able to get multiple different versions of software overall. That's one of the really, really cool things about the Nexus 6P. Yeah, it didn't really last as long as maybe other phones, but also you have to keep in mind other phones that came out in 2015, like the Samsung Galaxy S6, that thing stopped out at least a couple versions before the Nexus 6P. So again, even though it didn't last as long as you might have wanted it to, for a Nexus device, it lasted for quite a bit of time. So I give Huawei and Google a lot of credit for that. However, just like I've said before with the body, there was another humongous issue with these Huawei Nexus 6P, and that issue was the boot looping issue. That was one of the biggest issues ever, and that's something that recently we saw LG actually have to go through a lawsuit for, and believe it or not, they actually lost the lawsuit. So now for every Nexus 6P owner, they actually have to go and pay them back a little bit of money, which is super, super insane. And again, if you didn't have it or if you owned it or whatever the case is, you probably had a pretty decent time with it up until the moment where you started boot looping or where it had those issues. Is it the end of the world? No, but for a lot of people, they might have had a lot of precious information. They might have had, their phone cameras or their photos or their contacts or whatever on these devices. And if it started boot looping, there was really no way to actually gain back all the information without getting a new phone or factory resetting it and trying to go that way. And that was one of the biggest issues with this phone. The boot looping was something that Huawei had to go to court for, and eventually they lost that court. And the LG Nexus 5X, that actually had the same boot looping issue as well. So again, those are just two things that Huawei and LG both, they had to go through those lawsuits and everything, and eventually they didn't prevail. They have to pay those money back to the people, and that's super, super crazy. So good news is there's still some custom ROMs out there for it. If you're somebody who wants to root and custom ROM it, you have that capability, so you can always go and do those things if you like to. But at the end of the day, it was definitely one of those weird things that it was definitely like a weird era of time, especially with the Nexus 6P being such a good phone, but then being flawed by those boot looping and hardware defects and all that. Just a weird phone overall. Now moving on to the performance side of things, this thing was released with the Qualcomm Snapdragon 810 chipset, an octa-core CPU, an Adreno 430 GPU, and there were a couple different models, a 32, 64, and 128 gig model, but all those models had 3 gigabytes of RAM. And at that time in 2015, that was actually quite a bit of RAM. It wasn't a small amount. It definitely wasn't a big amount. It definitely wasn't a big ginormous amount either, but it was a pretty decent amount. Usually Nexus phones were kind of, known for being, a little bit inadequate when it comes down to the performance side of things. But this phone overall, I think, did a pretty decent job at it. It was still pretty smooth because this thing, because this thing has pretty stock software, it doesn't have too many things going with it. It does a pretty good job at handling the apps and everything that you load at it. And believe it or not, even devices like my Nexus 4 or my Nexus 5 still do a pretty decent job at it too, which is really surprising to me. And like I said, I remember when this phone came out, I really wanted it. Obviously, I couldn't afford it at the time, but I think I owned my Nexus 4 at the time or my LG G2, and I was like, wow, this phone is everything you needed in a phone and performance and everything. And even though it still kind of holds up today in terms of performance, I really would not recommend people using it, mostly because of those hardware defects and boot looping issues. But this phone did a pretty decent job with the performance, and even now, because of that stock software, it does a pretty decent job with the performance overall. So in terms of performance, that pretty much covers it. Now hitting on the camera, this thing, like I said, has a single camera on the back, a 12.3 megapixel lens, and it has laser autofocus. It has a couple other things going for it too, and I think the camera overall, like I said, is one of the better aspects of it for sure. It's not the best camera in the world, obviously, but for the Nexus lineup at that time, that was definitely one of the better aspects. A lot of people were hyping this camera up, and I was really happy about it too. When I was testing it and everything, it looked pretty good. I remember when I owned my Nexus 4 and my Nexus 5, even my Nexus 6, all those phones really didn't have that good battery life. They were all pretty inadequate for the most part. However, the Nexus 6P was pretty good, and then the Google Pixel line eventually came out, and that had a plus camera that had a very, very good camera sensor for sure. And the Nexus 6P, I think, was the stepping stone for that. But like I said, the 6P, because of those hardware defects, I have to mention it every time, it really didn't do its justice for sure. So, and on the front, it had an 8 megapixel camera. It was able to shoot 1080p videos, but you were able to do 4K at that back camera, but the front camera only 1080p. And again, not the end of the world or anything, but it is something to consider. That is a very, very important thing to note. The cameras on this thing were okay for both the cameras on this thing were okay combined, but the back camera for sure was definitely a thumbs up. Even now in 2020, it kind of holds up. Obviously, I would not recommend it because it's a single sensor, and I would recommend at least a dual core sensor, and I would recommend at least a dual camera sensor in 2020, but for a 2015 phone, it really wasn't that bad. Now, ending it off with the battery life, the 3450 mAh battery on this thing was pretty decent at the time, and I remember a lot of people talking about it, and I think a lot of people were kind of hating on it too much because they were saying the battery life wasn't wasn't that good. But for me, I pretty much had pretty decent battery life, even when I was using it last year and even now. Like, it wasn't really that bad. It had a pretty big screen at the time, but now, I mean, this is 5.7 inches. The iPhone 10 has a 5.8 inch panel, so it really wasn't that big of a difference. But the panel on this thing really wasn't even like a crazy panel. It's 1440p, but it's still pretty good with that big size battery. And I give Huawei and Google and all these other companies that were involved in this phone a lot of credit for making this phone have that big of a size battery. So for sure, at the end of the day, I think this phone had pretty decent battery life. Not even that great, but I think it was above average for the most part. So to kind of sum up this video and to answer the question, my voice is going out, would I recommend buying a Nexus 6P in 2020? I will say not at all. This phone is completely not worth it in 2020. If this phone did not have those defects at all, you know, the boot looping issues, the hardware defects, being able to bend easily, I would probably go with, yeah, this phone is probably worth it, you know, especially with the fact that it's super easy to custom ROM and root and all that. But in this day and age, I would not recommend buying a Nexus 6P in 2020. And it's funny because this is one of the phones I would usually recommend. Now I recommend people buying like a Galaxy S10 or something like that. Or if they're trying to save some money, get a Galaxy S8. But I would not recommend buying a Nexus 6P in 2020. I would recommend at least buying like a Galaxy S8 or Galaxy S9. If you want a pretty decent priced phone, I would recommend getting a Galaxy S10 or Galaxy S10 Plus. I'll go ahead and leave those phones linked down in the description below. Or even a Google Pixel 2 XL. Those phones are much better and do much better over time than this specific phone. I appreciate what the Nexus 6P brought at the time, but I really wouldn't recommend it anymore. So that pretty much covers it. If you guys have any other questions or anything, if you want to buy those phones, links will be down in the description below. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. But that is pretty much it. If you guys have any other questions or anything, leave it down in the comment section as well. Hit the like button, that means so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys could hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel, all those links are linked down below. I'd really appreciate if you guys could check it out. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.